Welcome to Tim Blackett and Friends. I'm Tim Blackett, a first-time author, a long-time reader, and an accidental book fluencer on TikTok. This is a show I started after years of daydreaming about it. One day, I sent out emails to a bunch of writers I had no business asking favors from, and these are the ones who have agreed to let me interview them. I hope you have as much fun as I did during the interviews. Oh, and P.S., I'm still working on a real intro ditty.
A one, two, three, four. Tim Blackett, baby dabba doo, deep dee bop bop doo, ribby deep dee bop dabba doo, bo deep dee bop bop doo. Tim Blackett, baby deep doo, baby deep bop bop doo. Tim Blackett, baby deep deep, dibby deep deep. Tim Blackett, baby deep deep, dibby deep deep bop. Tim Blackett, baby deep tip tip tip. Tim Blackett, Tim Blackett and friends. Friends on. Dibby deep 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 doo.
I was introduced to The Heartbreak Years, a memoir by Minda Honey, late in 2023. I was listening to all kinds of podcasts trying to get inspiration for my own. I've listened to various podcasts over the years, but as with many of my secondary interests, my listening days are up and down. But as I was trying to get my own pod off the ground, I started listening more intentionally. I wanted to expand my horizons, especially within the interview genre of podcasts. I started with one called The Stacks with Tracy Thomas, and the first episode I listened to featured Minda Honey as the guest. And after listening to their conversation, I immediately ordered the book, and then, on a whim, I emailed Minda to see if she'd like to come on the pod. I didn't know anything about the book other than what was talked about in that episode, but the way she was so candid about it and the way the conversation seemed to move in and out of the book into so much more, into life and commentary on society in general, made me think it would be a fun conversation. And in the same way the interviews seem to dance around like this, so does her book. It is called The Heartbreak Years, and essentially it is about the years following her breakup with her high school sweetheart that had followed her all the way through college, and then fell flat when they struck out to California to start a life together. But it starts to become about so much more than that. As Minda meets and starts dating and or fucking other boys, she tells those stories and the ways those relationships affected her, but she uses these relationships as jumping off points to talk about so many other things. It's about dating as a young Black woman in the 21st century, yes, but it's also about the struggles of finishing college in the middle of a recession, about believing in oneself even if it feels like the rest of the world thinks you're just floundering around, believing in yourself even when you don't believe in yourself. It's about learning to take yourself seriously so that others will take you seriously. It's about politics, sexual and personal, but also in general. It's about race relations in America and about tearing down patriarchal ideals around all of these things. At around 220 pages, the book is not big, but it is big-hearted, packing so many thoughts and ideas into its pages so that it becomes so much more than a simple chronological retelling of a string of bad and sometimes good dates through one woman's 20s. It becomes a looking glass through which to see many of the flaws and inconsistencies and maybe some of the joys and surprises of 21st century American society. The book has been called a momentous piece of art, and vibrant, tender, self-aware without being jaded, and compulsively readable without being easy. Minda is an essayist and a nonfiction writer. Her work has been published in the LA Review of Books, the Washington Post, the Guardian, Teen Vogue, and many other places. It's been featured in several anthologies, including Burn It Down, Women Writing About Anger. She is the editor at Black Joy at Recon News and has spent time as director of the BFA and creative writing program at Spalding University, an advice columnist for LEO Weekly in Louisville, and is the founder of the alt-indie publication Taunt. Minda Honey, welcome to Tim Blackett and Friends.
Wow, what a welcome that was. Thank you so much, Tim. You got me all hyped up and feeling myself now.
All right. You represent a couple of firsts for the pod, actually. You're the first person outside of Canada to be on the show, and you're also the first nonfiction writer we've had. So you're
wow.
blazing trails.
Well, hopefully I do a good job so that more nonfiction writers and more more folks from the United States and outside of Canada make it on as guests.
Yeah, I've got a few lined up here in the coming months, but you're the first. So I figured I'd start where I kind of always start these interviews by talking about your sort of writerly origin story. When did you start writing? Why did you start writing? Was there a moment in time where you thought, this is what I want to do?
I mean, I'm one of those, like, it's almost a cliche at this point, but I'm one of those writers who was like always writing as a kid, like I had a journal that I kept, and my dad was a computer programmer, so we had a computer in the house very early, and I can remember learning to type and typing up, me and Mavis Beacon were super close, and learning to type and typing up like a little story about jungle animals that had a tea party and forcing him to print it off on the old dot matrix printer that like, would shake the whole table when it printed and you had to pull the dotted strips off of the side. Um, so I was just always into writing and telling my own stories, always into reading. There was a library behind our house, so I would like go and check out dozens of Sweet Valley High books at the same time. And, spend all of my vision is terrible because I would spend so much time just like indoors reading. And actually, don't quote me on that because I'm not a doctor, but it could very well be genetic. So I always loved writing, always had a passion for it, but I didn't know how one made a living as a writer. Like my dad was a computer programmer when I was a kid, but he's also a disabled American veteran. My mother works at the post office. She's an immigrant from the Philippines. So for them, it was very much like do good in school, get a scholarship because we've saved no money so that you can go to college and then get a good, stable job in corporate America. So there was no like, this is how you become an artist. Like that's not the immigrant, children of immigrants story. Like you don't get
Mhm.
to grow up and be an artist. I didn't know how one did that. I didn't know any writers. I didn't know how that happened. And essentially I did do that. Like I went into corporate America, I went into communications and sales. And then at 29, as if you read the book, I'm like, I don't want to be the world's number one mop bucket salesman. And I left my job to get my MFA and subsequently spent my 20s figuring out how one makes a living as a writer.
I say this every episode, but I'm always interested in this weird origin that every writer has, where whether we're writing from young age or come to it later. It's always interesting for me. What draws you to nonfiction or memoir in general? Like you mentioned writing fantastic stories when you were a kid or whatever. So have you ever thought about writing fiction or poetry or what? Why memoir is your jam?
I think when you're a kid, you have a lot less concerns and like there's no outside pressures. So you just write whatever. You write poetry, you write short stories, you write novels. And you don't really think about like, oh, is this good? Like it's just the joy in creating something. But as you get older and you go through school, all of a sudden there are like grades and external opinions put on those things that you've created. So when I was an undergrad, I took a graduate level fiction workshop. And I guess my writing was not very good because the professor told me I did not deserve to be in her class. Around that same time, I mean, obviously I was heartbroken, but around that same time, I found out about nonfiction. I learned that like you did not need to be famous to write about yourself. And so I pivoted and I started writing about my own life. And when me and my high school sweetheart went through our breakup, some of those pieces, some of those essays, I started writing in real time. Fortunately, before I published the book, I became a better person and a better writer. So the stories about breakups and dating subsequently became better and less dramatic. So that's how I ended up in fiction. And I flirt with the idea, or that's how I ended up in nonfiction. And I
Yeah.
flirt with the idea of writing fiction. I'd love to like write a romance novel at some point. And I know people kind of turn their nose up at genre fiction, but I don't know. It seems fun. And,
Yeah.
we should try to have as much fun these days as possible because there are not a ton of opportunities.
Yeah, if writing is not fun, I don't know why we do it. I've been in conversations now that I had a book published in November, so I've been meeting new writers
Congrats.
and stuff like that. Thanks. Uh, and every now and then there's a presentation or someone talking and they're like, yeah, writing is hard work, and it's lonely, and uh you should, if you can't handle it, you shouldn't do it. It's hard work, it's not. But I'm like, that's not how I feel at all. I have so much. I never feel more myself than when I'm sitting down and writing, and I'm in, like, I write fiction, but when I'm in the middle of a thing. And I know everyone has a different relationship to the art they make, I guess, but that's such a strange feeling to like hate the thing that you're
Tim, I am so jealous of you because I am definitely one of those writers where like the only reason I write because the only time I'm more miserable when I'm writing is when I'm not writing.
Yeah.
Like it's very much a compulsion for me. And there are certainly parts of it that are joyful. Like you hit that flow, you hit that
Hmm.
groove. When you are finally able to articulate the thing you've been thinking or you're able to execute it on the page the same way that it's in your mind. Like they say, like I don't enjoy writing, but I enjoy having written.
Yeah.
So that's kind of but no, I mean, it can be a pretty torturous process, but I think that's all just part of it though. That's all just like, and I think that's what makes it so satisfying and so joyful on the other end of it is that like you endured something like climbing Everest
Yeah.
is an endurance thing. I don't know anybody would say they enjoyed it, but they enjoyed what it taught them about themselves.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree that the act of writing is hard. It's just the way people describe that hardness is different than what I think. Like there are other people who maybe are just getting into writing or haven't written anything and they tell me, "Oh, I've always wanted to write a book. I just have to sit down and do it." I'm like, "Well, yeah, but it also takes like years probably if it's your first book." So
Years.
it's not like
Yeah.
just a fluffy thing that we do, but also I just find it's yeah, invigorating. All the things you
I
said.
will speak to the loneliness aspect of it though, in
Yeah.
that I have found so much community in writers, and in writing as like, a workshop leader, as a student, as a peer. I like some of my closest friends are writers, and some of like my most diverse groups of friends are like writers because we're all coming to a community because we love this thing called writing. Whereas a lot of times, certain social circles you have are very dependent on your age or where you went to school, whether or not you're married, whether or not you have kids, where you work. Whereas with writing, because it's like people from all these different walks of life coming together, you really do learn about so many different perspectives. And there's
Mhm.
just like more of an exchange of ideas. And we're a lot less, I think writers are a lot less siloed than some other communities. I mean, sure, sometimes we're broken down by genre and things like that. We have our subsets, but overall, like, when I'm friends with a writer, I don't think like, oh, this person's 20 years younger than me or this person's 20 years older than me. It's like, are we coming from the same place when it comes to words? And I think that's a really special gift.
Mhm. So you mentioned being in college and realizing all of a sudden that nonfiction is a thing that you are allowed to write about yourself, even if you're not famous. So I'm just wondering who, or were there any books in particular that brought that to your attention? Like for me, with the essay form, I had this thing that it was just like boring schoolwork,
Yeah.
but I was assigned Small Wonder by Barbara Kingsolver in one of my English lit classes and just personal essays about gardening and stuff. And I was like, wow, you can really like say a lot and write some beautiful things in essay. Well, who taught you that or who showed you that it's okay?
Well, I can't say that I read much nonfiction in undergrad that I found inspiring. Like definitely a lot of it just kind of felt like work. But it was actually another student in that fiction class who kind of realized that a lot of my fiction was just thinly like
Hmm.
disguised things happening in my life. And she was like, you could just write about yourself if you want to. And she was also just, could tell I was having a hard time in that class and so kind. And I actually thank her in the acknowledgments,
Hmm.
Vidalia, for give me that vote of confidence when nobody else seemed to like believe in my writing. And yeah, so from there, I don't like even when I went to grad school, when I went to my MFA program, on the very first day in the very first class, my professor was going around the room and asking each of us like what we write, what we're doing. And I was like, oh, I write memoir. And she was like, what's your favorite memoir? And my mind went blank. And I was like, have I read a memoir? Like, wait a second. And it totally threw me for a loop. And on one level, it seems kind of ludicrous to go to grad school to get an MFA to write a memoir if you're not reading memoir. But on the other hand, my life was not writing. My life was sales. Like I was oriented in a completely different way. And the things I was learning, the things I was focused on were not writing until I made this very drastic shift and my world shifted in so many different ways. And at that point, I started really getting into nonfiction writers that I loved. But up until that point, a lot of the writers that were influencing my nonfiction were fiction writers: Toni Morrison, Toni K. Bambara, Zora Neale Hurston, Gail Jones, a lot of Black women writers. And I think when you read my nonfiction, you can sense that I have a very literary fiction background. It's very narrative based. The writing is very literary, and I think it's a ode to those influences.
Hmm. Yeah, it definitely felt very like approachable and like just you're invited in and taken along. Like, yeah, that was really interesting. But when did this book become like, okay, now I'm going to write this book? The question sometimes people ask, what made you feel this was the story you had to tell?
Yeah, I think with nonfiction writers, creative nonfiction writers, a lot of times it is compulsion. I like this was the most major thing happening in my life, was that this like the end of this relationship and trying to figure out who I was going to be as a person in the world. I was like, God on the first day of the seventh day of that 7 day week of like, I got to create a whole world from scratch. And so like I said, some of those pieces were written in real time. Like, even though I didn't know how to make a living as a writer, I always took different community-based writing workshops. I joined a writing group in Orange County, and I was the youngest person by like 40 years. Everyone else was significantly older than me and white. And I would show up every week and like be like, me and my boyfriend broke up and I want to die. And I'd write like these super dramatic essays about the breakup and like what he did to me by breaking my heart. And, they would just be like rolling their eyes. Like, they were writing totally different stuff. They had no interest in what I was writing. And eventually the group disbanded. And it was probably because I would not stop showing up. And so I was just writing about my life. That's all I was doing, was documenting my time. And then as I took more writing workshops, I started to apply craft to the writing and thinking about how to tell this story and what insights I wanted to like incorporate and what message I wanted to deliver. So by the time I got to my MFA program, I knew that I wanted to write about heartbreak and dating. And it just kind of came down to what is the larger narrative and how do like I execute on this at, a certain level of craft in order to sell this book.
Hmm. Yeah, that's one thing I appreciated about the book so much was that it was, the story, your story, but it also was wrestling with a lot of different ideas. On my TikTok, I had a video a while back in which I said I don't like celebrity memoirs because usually it just feels like this story and it might be titillating, but it doesn't really say much about the wider
Mm,
world. And I had
yes.
so many people angry at me saying, "Oh, memoir can do so much more than." I'm like, I know that, but celebrity memoirs in general don't, at least the ones I've read. But that there are many memoirs that are worthwhile and beautiful and even like profound works of art. And so when I made my way through this, I was really happy to find that it was much more than like a simple dating in your 20s story. But
Right. Well, Roxane Gay says the best nonfiction looks inward and outward at the same time. And
hmm,
Layla Lalami was one of my professors in grad school, and she really taught us to orient our story within the larger story because, my life wasn't happening in a vacuum. And so I think the fact that I became single and started dating and was trying to figure myself out as a young adult at the same time as the US elected its first Black president means something. Like, those two
hmm,
things play on each other. So by doing that, that allowed me to take a much broader scope with my writing. And that also allowed folks to, as you said, be invited in and to find their own connections. Like you were not a young Black woman dating in Southern California in 2008, but you have your own experience, even as a Canadian, of what it was like to witness the US do something like that and what the ripple out effect of those political moves were for you.
Hmm. That whole part was really interesting because, like you said, I have my perspective of America electing its first Black president. I was living in Indiana in 2004.
Okay, I know Indiana.
Yeah, I lived in a town called Goshen,
Okay.
Indiana. It's like it formed like a triangle 2 hours away from Indianapolis and 2 hours away from Chicago. But anyway, I was there for the when Bush was elected the second time. I was there as part of a, I was working on a theology degree and I was working in a church. Anyway, that perspective, having all these people around me in a church really rooting for Bush and me being Canadian and having different ideas. I mean, I was still, I didn't know what, it was just a weird perspective. But then all of the, since then with the Obama presidency and then to like revert to the Trump presidency, it's all just been like, what is America doing?
Right.
I
What are
don't
y'all
know.
doing down there? Get it together.
But it's always interesting. I don't know. One thing that struck me about the book was how gentle it was.
Mm.
It's pretty raw, telling of your life in your 20s, and you don't seem to hold a lot back. And you're investigating a lot of really big and sort of problematic things, like the patriarchal and even misogynistic ways people think about dating, how many of the men you were dating or sleeping with seemed to feel a certain way about you sleeping around while they were doing the same thing, or how you felt uncomfortable and many times unsafe while dating. I mean, the stories seem to justify a certain anger or resentment, but that never comes across. You're bringing attention to the seriousness of these things, but you're never mean, never vindictive about anything, but instead remain gentle. I don't know how else to put it. So I'm wondering,
Yeah.
how did you straddle the line between calling out the men or people or society in general while still remaining like civil and even upbeat through most of it?
Well, they call that growth. Because that's certainly that's certainly not how Minda the individual felt like living through those moments and period of my life. But one of the things I had to think about was that so one of the questions I get a lot about the men is like, how did they feel about this book? Did you have conversations with them? Da 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 da. But the thing is that these men are characters because these
Mhm.
relationships happened like 15 years ago. And I only knew one portion of them, just a sliver of them. So I would imagine if you went and tracked any of them down, the things they would say about me would feel unfamiliar to me. And it's because they also knew me 15 years ago and only knew a certain sliver of me. So it's easier for me with like time and distance to recognize that to also, as I'm writing a book about how I was trying to figure out how to become a person that they likely were similarly trying to figure out how to be people at that portion of time in their lives. And I also am like, this is like my perception and experience of that person, but I don't live inside their bodies. I don't live inside their experience. I can only make certain like assumptions, but I can't like conclusively say this person was an asshole and they did this thing to hurt me specifically. I can't do those things. But what I can do is take a look at my own behavior and comb through that because I do live within my own experience. I do live inside my body and my mind and think, why did I participate? Why did I have perfect attendance for the fuckery? Like, why did I show up to this? Like, no matter what a relationship dynamic is, everyone's contributing because that's what a relationship is, right? Like you can't be a part of a relationship and not be contributing something in some way to it. So why was my contribution to remain in a situation that was not meeting a whole host of needs that I had? And so I think that's what made the book interesting, like exploring that. And it's not victim blaming, not saying like, oh, it was my fault you were mean to me. No, but it was my fault to
Hmm.
show up so that you could be mean to me. So how do I move forward from that? How do I protect myself from that in the future? Or is that just like a risk of relationships? Is that sometimes you open yourself up to the wrong people? And if that's the case, how do I get out of that situation quicker? So I wanted to explore that what led me to make those choices. But I also, like you said, was gentle about it because I was young. I was young. I didn't know things. We don't equip young people in in the US. We don't, are likely in Canada too. We don't equip us with like tools towards emotional intelligence and how to communicate and form relationships and be in community with people. We don't have the language. We don't have the experience. We're not able to witness people doing that in a healthy way. So, I was really doing the best that I could with what I had, and I learned a lot along the way. So for me, it was really important not to shame or overly harshly judge this younger version of myself. And I've had a number of young women in their early 20s DM me on Instagram talking about like, I found your book. I'm going through this right now. Like, I'm so, so appreciative of you for writing this because it's also now allowed them to be gentler with themselves and their
Mm.
perceived like missteps or mistakes. Like we can't grow from a shameful place. And I also tell the writers that take my classes too that like you can't create from a place of shame either. Like your writing cannot withstand the weight of your shame. So if you
Hmm.
want to write something that is powerful and potent, you have to give up the shame first.
Yeah, that reminds me of one of the blurbs at the front, I think, of your book by Casey.
Kiese Layman.
Yeah, say layman. It will teach a generation of us what's possible when writing through to and beneath the pulpy side of desire and fear. Even more than that, just a book like this shows young writers or young people that maybe writing through this stuff and then recognizing that shame there and pulling that out and being gentle with yourself might be a worthwhile endeavor, maybe.
It was worthwhile for me,
Yeah,
both for my writing and for like my perception of self.
yeah. I find like I don't want my writing to come off as like self-therapy when other people are reading it, but it definitely is a way for me to work through whatever's bouncing around up in my old noggin.
Hmm. Absolutely. Particularly by the time you get to the end of a book. Like,
Yeah.
because then you just been like sitting in this stuff and you can start connecting all of these different dots that you might not have even realized were part of your constellation prior to assembling a book.
Hmm. Something I find really fascinating, you mentioned it here just a minute ago, talking about the people in your book, which is Memoir and a True Story, as characters. In fact, it was my next question to talk about. You talked about this with Tracy on the stacks a little bit, in that it seems to be even when writing about yourself or writing a true story about yourself, still something about the act of putting it on paper sort of removes it from yourself or something. I
Hmm.
wonder if you could talk about this more in not necessarily with the book, but in general, how yeah, we're writing really openly and vulnerably about ourselves, but once it's there and other people are reading it, it still is a way of separating ourselves from those things a little bit. I don't know. What do you have to say about that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess two things. I'm teaching a year-long memoir course right now, and
Mm.
we're looking a lot at Cheryl Strayed's Wild, and we're also reading Alden Jones's The Wanting is a Wilderness, which is both a memoir and a extended craft essay on Wild. And she's talking about Cheryl Strayed's radical empathy. And so by Cheryl Strayed, the author, showing Cheryl, the character within the book, radical empathy, she makes space for readers to also show themselves radical empathy. But she's only, as an author, able to do that by constructing a persona. Now, the persona is not some disingenuous version of yourself. It's just a slice of who you are, the portions of yourself that are relevant to the memoir, that you've constructed. And Alden Jones is saying that she's actually quoting Mary Karr as saying that the best memoirists that she's ever met are exactly as they appear to be on the page. And so,
Hmm.
in order to create that affect, you cannot put all of yourself on the page because then there's nothing that doesn't come into focus. You don't come into focus as a person. You're just a jumble. No one has a sense of who you are. So the only way to come across as real is to construct a persona, which is kind of, I guess goes against logic to some degree, but that's how
Hmm.
nonfiction works. So that's one thing. And then the second thing is that as a nonfiction writer and as somebody who's on the knocking on the door of 40, my memory is not the same, as it was in my youth. And I think a lot about memory, and I think a lot about what writing about my life as a memoirist does to the memory, because every time you access a memory, you're essentially destroying the memory. And so I've been listening to this book about, and I think it's called Why Do We Remember? And so it's really about like how our memories biologically are not designed for us to have like this catalog of every experience. Your
Hmm.
memory is only keeping and holding on to the information that it thinks will serve you in some way going forward. So just kind of thinking about memory differently, then I think also makes me think about my writing differently and like what I'm doing as a writer by like documenting my life. And so this is a really long roundabout way of basically saying that like everything is story. Everything is story, even the truth is story, because our memory of a series of events is not accurate and it becomes less accurate over time. The way that we experience something and perceive something then becomes like a lens for how we perceive and experience the next thing. So our memories also shape our present and our future. So
Hmm.
it's like a what is that word? Ouroboros. It's like, a snake eating its own tail kind of thing.
Okay.
Um, which I don't even remember if I'm answering your question, but yes, I think about this. I think about this a lot. And like, the best way to be honest, which is like there's me and my sister, who's a financial analyst, argue about this all the time because she's very into numbers. And I'm like, yeah, like when you tell the truth, there's capital T truth, but then there's lowercase t truth. And one of them
Mm.
gets at like the truth of like the emotions. And then one of them's concerned with like facts and details. Like we're not writing court documents, we're writing memoirs.
Yeah.
So what is true and what is story? And how do those things and in what ways are those two threads actually inseparable?
Yeah, that's really beautiful, and it reminds me a lot of like people who listen to this are probably tired of me talking about autofiction, but the way you're talking about writing memoir reminds me of so many of the ways people writing autofiction talk about it. Not, and
Mm,
there is an obvious separation between those two things, but for me, especially in memoir, when I'm reading a memoir and people, you can tell they expect me to believe this is just a true and chronological series of events that happened exactly this way. If that is too in my face, like this actually, I don't care. I don't want to read that. I'm more interested in the ways we're structuring narrative in order to get at this lowercase truth you're talking about. Like that to me is what's interesting. And maybe other people come at it a different way, but I feel like that's, yeah, the way to talk about being a person in the world today is we're all telling stories about ourselves all the time, even when we post that little picture on Instagram or whatever.
hmm
But why are we telling this story, and why are we telling it in this way, and why are we leaving things out and all that stuff? Like that is what's interesting for me, whether it's fiction or memoir. That I think is what keeps me alive with literature.
Right. And that's the relationship between creative nonfiction and fiction is that, something doesn't necessarily have to be true to be honest. So as a fiction writer, you're putting a lot of truth in your work, even though it's all made up. So as a nonfiction writer, Is my work any more true or honest if I insist that like memory is infallible? Like,
Hmm.
because we know that's not true. We forget things all the time, or we can like me and you could take a car ride someplace and then tell two totally different versions of that car ride. And it's like, okay, well, which is the truth? Which is
Hmm.
honest? And it's like, you can really lose yourself in like trying to go through those things with a fine-tooth comb. So you as like regardless of what genre you write in, and I guess regardless of whether or not you're a writer at all, you really do have to figure out where those demarcations are for you on like truth and honesty. And I think all of it is also contextual too. Like I said, there's a court document and then there's like a memoir.
Hmm.
And so like the stakes are very different for those two things.
Mm. I remember reading once, and I think about this all the time, like maybe every day. I read where scientists, the people studying brain stuff, they were comparing. Anyway, they asked people to recall a memory and tell a story of their memories. And they found that the same bits that were lighting up in their brain as they were recalling something from their past are the same bits that like children light up when they're playing make believe, just playing pretend in their backyard.
Mm.
So this really threw me for a whole thing because I'm like, well, if we're just inventing our memories as we come, then what are we doing? But at the same time, it makes so much sense because, like you said, the same car ride could be different. Or like me and my sisters grew up in the same house with the same things happening, same holidays, same
Yes.
whatever. But we
I
have
too have
very
sisters.
different, yeah. And we have very different stories of our childhood. It's just so like this whole area is so fascinating for me, the idea of memory and how it fails us, but also is able to create such beautiful stories, whether they're heartbreaking or fun. I don't know. I'm just rambling.
Yes.
Yeah.
You're allowed to ramble on your own podcast.
Yeah, that's right. It's my show. I guess I'll finish here with the book. I I really, again, I said this again and again, appreciated how many ideas were in the book. But one thing I really found intriguing, especially towards the end and the epilogue in particular, was how much of the book was actually about friendship. You're telling stories
Mm.
of your dating life and all of this stuff, but in fact, you're moving all across America from Louisville to Cincinnati to Orange County and Denver and LA and all these places. But in each place, it seems like you were able to at least form some sort of friendship group that kept you sane and you were able to vent. Like, I made a video on TikTok that was talking about making friends in your 30s, just sort of off the cuff while I was smoking outside. And it's like what has made my page what it is. It has like almost 750,000 views, and that along with some other things has made my page what it is. Anyway, it seems like people have a hard time making friends in their adulthood, but it seems, at least from the book, that you maybe didn't have a hard time, though I'm sure it felt like it sometimes. I'm wondering if you have a philosophy around friendships, or how are you able to meet and find people, your people, in all of these different cities you're living in?
It's funny that, you were talking about the challenges of making friends in your 30s. Like, yeah, I'm the editor of Black Joy, and we just had our team meeting today. And one of our social media folks was talking about how she's, young. She just joined this group, Young, Black, and Employed in Dallas. And like, because she's just moved to Dallas, like, she hasn't been in Dallas very long, but she's trying to make friends. And so this group has been one of the ways, but that, among her friend group of young professionals who have been moving all around the country, they're all really struggling with this. Like, how do you make friends outside of college? And I was like, this is so funny that like some things change, but some things stay the same, because I was like, I literally went through this very same experience at your age. And then even in your 30s, thinking about how to make friends, like I moved back home to Louisville in my 30s in Kentucky, I was a boomerang. And
Mhm.
so sure, I had some friends from like high school and college, but a lot of those people had gotten married and had kids and did not have the sort of social life that I was going to be having as a single childless early 30s. So I had to make a lot of new friends. And I think, it was hard, but that same desperation that I brought to finding love that did not work was actually a very successful technique for finding friends, because you just show up and you tell people, I need friends, I am lonely, and you be vulnerable and you meet other people who are also lonely and vulnerable and who are also not ashamed to admit such. And then those people become your friends. Usually that's the subtext. Like, we're not all showing up to happy hour and being like, I need a bestie. But that's, that's kind of the thing. Like, you can have a happy hour and say, call it networking, but that's essentially like, how do you make friends in business, right? But you can very much have an event that's specifically for that purpose. And people don't have to feel embarrassed or shy about showing up in the same way that you would if somebody held a singles event in your town and it's like, oh, are people going to judge me for being single? Are there going to be weirdos there? You don't think about all those things when it comes to a networking event. There's a different level of vulnerability, and the stakes are presented in a different manner, even though they are very, very similar things. Connection is connection.
Hmm. So would you say in each of these places that you've lived, that is kind of how you found friends, was going to these types of events purposely for the idea of making friends?
Oh, yeah. I mean, when I was in Denver, I was so desperate for friends. I joined a bowling league. My dad was like, who are you? He's like, I feel like you just told me you started shucking corn for a living. Like, what do you mean bowling? And it was like, I just go to drink mimosas and talk with people. Like, I didn't win any bowling awards. They gave me an award that was like best dressed.
I see.
But I did it to make friends. And you know what? I did. I came out, came out of that bowling team with some pals.
Yeah. I think that's the key. That's something I mentioned in that video, was that I had been recently divorced, and so I was like just floundering around and wishing I had people to do things with. And I had one buddy just kind of tell me, go do it on your own. You don't have to have. So that was the thing. I just went and started doing stuff, and then because I was doing stuff, there were other people there also doing that, and so I could, reach out and make some friends. I don't know.
Yeah, just start showing up.
It is interesting. The stories we mostly tell about ourselves in literature and movies and everything tend to revolve around romantic stories and that's fascinating. Everyone is interested. We want to find love and all of those things, but this book in particular and others, even my own life, it seems like the stories of friendship are sometimes more important than those romantic stories. That those sometimes come and go. Hopefully one will stay, but then the thing with friends is they too come and go, but there might be some that extend throughout your entire life. And like, I feel like these are important stories that need to be told the same way our romantic stories need to be told.
Absolutely. And we've taken friendships for granted to such an extreme that there's an epidemic of loneliness, not just in the United States, globally. And it's because a lot of people don't have, obviously, they're lonely because they don't have things, they don't have friends. And they're also ashamed to speak up on the fact, like, nobody wants to be 20 something, 30 something, 40 something, 60 something, and being like, oh, I don't have friends, because then they
Mm-hmm.
feel like that's a reflection on them, that there's something wrong with them. And so people don't say that, but there are a lot of people who don't have any close friendships. So we need to start talking about the value and importance of friendship more, and making it easier for people to gain those sorts of connections. When last year for Valentine's Day for Black Joy, like I was actually I was working on a different piece and then asked these questions, tacked on these questions for Black Joy. I was speaking to a Black therapist who mainly works with Black women about, just kind of like this uphill struggle of like dating and finding love. And she was like, yeah, well, a lot of my clients are single and also friendless. And I was like, what? I thought my life was hard being like single in my 30s. I didn't realize, like, oh, snap. I don't got a man, but I got a ton of friends. And so I think that helped me really kind of reframe, reorient, and write that epilogue for the book, because it's like, yeah, I want to celebrate these mostly women who have been by my side over the decades. And a lot of the women in the book that, I speak about are I'm still friends with today. And like you said, like I've had some reviewers be like, the book ends with friends, but she didn't say anything about friends up until this point. It's like, excuse me, chapter 2 is all about how I was looking for friends on Craigslist. You know, like
Hmm.
I feel like I'm constantly talking about friends and going out with friends and these different things, and then it kind of like it's like a subtle thread that culminates by the end of the book. Same thing with career, because I graduated into the recession, my career opportunities were very uncertain. And so that kind of is a growing thread towards the end of the book as well.
Yeah. I don't have a great transition to this next, but I'm just gonna go.
Let's just go for it. We'll just dive
Yeah.
into the next topic.
I wanted to maybe move from inside the book for a minute to like talk about what went into publishing it and even just writing it. Maybe talking I I know you worked on part of it as your for your MFA, is that right?
Hmm.
And so once it's finished and now you've got a book, like how did you go about publishing it? How did you find your publisher? Did you have an agent? What were you doing to get it out there?
Yes. So for nonfiction, you can sell a book on proposal. So the book literally doesn't exist until after you get the book deal.
Mm,
And so that's the route that I went. And actually, it ended up being that a lot of what I had already previously written in my MFA and in the lead up to the MFA gave me a lot of material to work with to revise into a book. But before I sold the book, I had just like no idea how much I had already written towards this book. But yeah, I graduated my MFA in 2016. I had an essay go viral for long reads in February of
mm.
2017, Woman of Color and Wide Open Spaces. And at that point, I had some agents reach out to me. But like I said, I didn't know how much book I had already actually written. So I turned them down, was like, oh, I'm not ready. But I did also have other opportunities to publish. So I published a lot more essays, really grew my platform as a writer, stacked some bylines, and in 2019 began querying agents, which I think is like the hardest part of the book selling process because you like agents have a very long window of time to get back to you. And also, if they're not interested, they might not necessarily, because they're so slammed, have the opportunity to actually send you a rejection. So you're just kind of like, I don't know what's going on for quite a bit of that time. But when you have an agent, then all the other rejections, you have a team, like, you're in it with someone else. So all of those bylines or that time that I spent writing, though, obviously as a writer did not go to waste, but it also is what ultimately brought my agent to me because she read my essay and burned it down and then was like, "Oh my gosh, like what else has she written?" And then subsequently read everything else that I had published and then emailed me. So even though the querying process was uncertain, the fact that like I was already out there as a writer is what attracted an agent. And so I signed with her December of 2019 and we decided we would go out on submission March 2020. Um, for obvious reasons, that did not happen. The pandemic set in. I was the director of a college program and was like trying to figure out how to move the classes online and do what I could for the students who were also, some of them working on the front lines. And then being in Louisville, Kentucky, this is also, the home of Breonna Taylor. And so there were uprisings around her unjust murder by the police. So between the pandemic and the protest, it was not really a ripe opportunity to be putting together a book proposal. My agent reached out to me almost immediately and was like, "Hey, take care of yourself, focus on what you need to focus on. We'll go out whenever this is ready." So we went out on submission in July, and we were submitted to 10 editors and I got 10 rejections. And my
Mm.
agent was like, "This book will sell. We just need to make a couple of tweaks to the proposal and then it'll be fine." But I was very in my feelings. And so it took me several months to make about 10 minutes worth of edits. And we did not go back out on submission until October 1st. And it ended up in a three-way auction. So the book was sold by the end of October to Little A and then came out October 1st of 2023. And when I saw in the book deal 2023 is the publication year, I was like, I'm sorry, is this a mistake? Like, I did not realize like when you sell a book on proposal, that means that book is not going to hit the shelves for another 2, 3, 4 years.
Yeah.
So yeah, so it's a little bit of a different process than with fiction, but a lot of that is because again, the book literally just doesn't exist. Whereas with fiction, for the most part, you need to have the full manuscript to sell the book.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting process, and how all of us get to the publishing world in a slightly different way. It's really interesting.
Yeah.
But so now the book's out in the world, it's on the shelves, it's in the shops, Amazon, wherever. So I wanted to ask a question that someone asked me a couple of weeks ago. I was part of a panel for the Writers Festival at the public library here.
Yay.
The panel was talking about first manuscripts and all of that. So one of the people in the audience asked the question, what happens when the book is published? What do you do next? And he said, other than starting something new, like, is the book is just out there on its own now, or what happens? So I've been thinking about this because for me it really did feel like Pub Day was sort of sending it off into the ocean, and I just had to wait to see if anyone pulled it out of the sea. And I felt like I still feel to a degree that I was kind of lost now that I didn't have this release date or the book launch to look forward to. So, how have you felt since publishing? Do you find the whole thing takes on a life of its own after? Or what have you done in relation to the book since it's been out?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like everything and nothing changes when you put out a book. And I'd heard writers say that or had friends who had published books that had said that to me, but I don't think I really realized like the extent to which that is true until I was in it. But particularly for my book, because I had to live my 20s and then I had to spend, my 30s writing about my 20s. So for, 15 years, I've been living mentally in my 20s. And now all of a sudden, my heartbreak years are over. They've been bound in a book. They've been sent out to the world. So it becomes, all right, well, now what? Now what is my life? What is my driving narrative? What is it that I am concerning myself with? Like, I don't need to define myself any longer by the men who have broken my heart. Who am I? What matters to me now? I don't know. So there was like that personal kind of like, I don't like, I think zeitgeist is the wrong word, but just like existential crisis happening. And then there was, yes, the like finding like what is my next project going to be. And then there's just everything wrapped up into doing all the things you can do on your part to try to like make sure your book reaches the readers it needs to reach, and also enables you to put the next book out into the world. And you really learn the extent to which you do and don't have control over those things. So, I did do a book tour. I did podcasts. You push the book on your socials and then you just kind of like have to hope for the best in a lot of ways. So yeah, your life changes in a number of profound ways, but also you still got to get up and go back to work the next day. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like even when you think about mega bestseller books, those authors, like for the most part, didn't wake up on pub day millionaires. Like, they still had to keep going to work until their advance earned out.
Hmm. So, what is next? Do we get to have a Minda Honey in her 30s memoir, or what's going on now?
Yeah, I think that is actually what's next. I've been playing with this idea, like the crisis of 39. So
Mm.
39, I'll be 40 next January. And so, my life does not look like what I anticipated it would look like at 39. And I'm actually just kind of like unmoored any way that you could possibly be unmoored. Like I don't have a car. I feel like I've like been staying at my mom's. I've been like in the process of moving to Philadelphia, but was also doing a ton of travel. So I moved out of my place in November and then went apartment hunting in February and did not find an apartment. So I've like had this extended stay at my mother's house, which is, not where I expected to find myself at 39. I'm single. Yeah. So, and just kind of thinking like, and the book's out. And so it's like, okay, now what? Like I think at every age, you all of a sudden like, oh, this is the year. By the time I turn this age, I'm gonna have it all figured out. And so you make that mistake in your 20s of like, oh my gosh, I have to figure it all out by my 30s. And then you turn 30, and for most of us, it's like, oh dang, I don't know anything, but also I don't need to know anything. But then when 40 is approaching, you just expect like, oh, look at all that stuff I learned by the time I turn 30. I'll definitely have everything figured out by 40. And it's like, no, no, I don't know. I don't know what's happening. So, yes, so I think the next book will, in a way, be about my 30s. It's going to be about the crisis of 39 and like what that means for me as a woman and like, just like the things that happen with your body, the expectations, and what that means for me like too is like as a writer and a creative. One of the things that I've noticed about Black women, even like when you look at actresses, a lot of Black women don't get the accolades that their same white peers get until a later age. So you might see a Gabrielle Union becoming a top actress being celebrated in her late 30s when the actors that she came up with like Julia Stiles like their careers peaked in their 20s. And so we have to stick with it longer in order to reap the same benefits, the same success. And so I'm entering into that era. Like I put out my first book, I was 38. Now I'm 39. How do I capitalize on this momentum? What do these like next stages of my life look like? And also what happens if like at this point it doesn't happen? Like, I think a lot of people start to ask themselves that question when they hit midlife. Like when Bell Hooks passed away, she was exactly twice my age. I think she was 70 and I was 35 at the time. So I was like,
Hmm.
I'm literally at 35, I could potentially be at the middle of my life. So what does that mean like going forward? What does that look like and what does that mean like as like a creative? So, yeah, lots of thoughts about my 30s.
I'll be waiting for that, interested in that. I too I turned 40 in October, this coming October, so
You get
we're pretty
it.
much the same. And the novel I'm working on now, I'm about halfway through, is about a group of people turning 40 and who have been they were very close in high school and now they're not as close and they're trying to figure out what life means around friendship, parenthood, career wise, all these things. It's called We Were Meant to Be Grown Ups, and it's wrestling with all of these
Oh,
questions that I think maybe all of us elder millennial people are wrestling with. So I'm excited for that.
as like a single person, one of the things that I guess I have a morbid fascination around is like the way connections um are like impacted by divorce because so
Mm.
many of my married friends are friends with other married people or people who have kids around the same age as them in the way that like it messes up their social group when somebody gets a divorce because it's almost like divorce is contagious. And so like you see these friendships shift or they get divorced and then they don't connect with like their still married friends in the same way. And so I don't know if your book is going to touch on any of those things, but if so, I'll be like reading as a curious outsider.
Yeah, I think some of that will be in there. I mean, my own life, I was divorced at 32. And so I found most of our couples friends, whether it's true or not, I felt they were all hanging out with my ex, and I was kind of here. I'm like, oh, I actually don't really have any real connections to anybody. So yeah, I had to work through that. So I think that'll make it into the book. The whole thing is just me in like six different characters thinking about the way, I don't know. We'll see how it goes. I'm about 40,000, 45,000 words in, so
Okay.
I'm having fun writing it at least. Yeah. So I think we'll move into the penultimate segment. In the book, you talk about all the cities you've lived in. We've talked about it a little bit. You seem to travel all across the country for jobs or whatever was going on. So you're in Louisville, obviously, but you spent time in Cincy and Orange County and Denver and Los Angeles. Are there any other cities you've lived in?
No, I think that's all of them.
Okay. Well, I told you I
Oh,
spent.
well, Riverside. I did live in Riverside for grad school, which is
Okay.
inland. It's kind of near Joshua Tree. It's
Okay.
in inland California.
Well, I told you I spent a little time in the US. Yeah, I lived in Indiana for a while. But I visited a lot of cities. It's weird, but I spent like 1 day in quite a few cities. I spent 1 day in Atlanta, 1 day in Las Vegas, 1 day in Salt Lake City and Tampa. I spent
I've
a
been to all those cities, sure.
Yeah, I spent a few weekends in Indianapolis when I was in Goshen. We'd go there, and same with Chicago, so a little more there. And then I spent a week in Los Angeles once. But anyway, I always felt like each city seemed to have its own personality. Like
Mhm.
Chicago was not Atlanta, was not LA, was not any of these other. You'd agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I've been to I think 44 out of 50 states.
Oh,
So
awesome.
that's what happens when you're a salesman,
Yeah.
and just like and a person who loves a good road trip. So yes, I mean beyond the cities, every small town has its own flavor. But yeah, everyone has its own identity. I would say the cities with the most distinct identity, New
We'll just wait a
Orleans.
sec here.
Oh, sorry.
No, because I feel like you're going to start answering the question so I'm going to interrupt you to say uh, this penultimate segment will put you on the spot a little bit, but I thought I'd make you create a personality profile for some of these cities. We
Okay.
can do however many you want, but like if you were to think as Louisville, if Louisville were a person, what is that person like?
So one of the things that I hear people say a lot about Louisville, like to describe it as a city, is that it's very humble. It's a very humble city. I think that Louisville is when you throw a party, there's three groups of people, right? The person that you're pretty sure isn't gonna come, they're gonna bail. They're the people that are gonna come and they're gonna be the life of the party. But then there's that middle group of people who are going to come. They consistently come. They show up for all your parties, but they're kind of like background flavor, But it wouldn't be a party without them. That's Louisville because we always pop up in history, in popular culture, in these weird and unexpected ways, but we don't take up much space in the national consciousness. People write Kentucky off, but at the same time, Mitch McConnell from Kentucky, like we're what I'm saying? Like we matter here. Muhammad Ali, the greatest to ever do it, from
Yeah.
Louisville, just centrally located. We are less than a day's drive from the majority of the major cities in the US. We've just played some really interesting roles. So that's how I would describe Louisville. We're not the star of the party, but it wouldn't be a party without us.
Okay, so you're at the same party. Louisville's there, being subtly important. New Orleans walks in. What is New Orleans like?
New Orleans is the life of the party. New Orleans comes in. New Orleans is the person that comes in where like you kind of just like grudgingly went to a party and didn't expect to have a good time, but then New Orleans arrives and you're like, "Oh, I didn't know New Orleans was going to be here." And the next thing you know, you caught up in some things that you never anticipated getting caught up in, but you are having the time of your life. You just hope it doesn't end up result in the end of your life because New Orleans can get out of hand very quickly.
Okay, so you're tagging along with New Orleans, and now Denver pulls up beside you. What's Denver doing?
Oh gosh. Well, in the book, the Denver chapter is titled White People's Atlanta. Uh yeah, Denver is trying to convince you to go on a hike. Denver is wearing the same pair of leggings one too many times past wash day. Denver, like leggings, like I don't want to be anti-feminist here, but leggings are not appropriate for business meetings, okay? You have to put on legitimate pants. Yeah, that's Denver. Denver just want to like be outside and wants you to be outside with them. But you know what? Ticks live outside, so I'm not going.
All right, last one. You say, get out of here, Denver. I don't want to go on a hike. So
No.
then, Orange County. Is Orange County a city or
Yes, Orange County is both a city and a county.
yeah.
But then there, are smaller cities within Orange County. And so within the county, Anaheim, where Disneyland is,
Hmm.
Laguna Beach, if you ever watched the show, The Real Laguna Beach. Um, they all
So
fall within.
where were you when you were in Orange County?
So I primarily was in Costa Mesa. So Costa Mesa is uh, kind of almost creates like a elbow with Newport Beach and Irvine, which is like the safest city in America. It's
Hmm.
completely planned, very Taco Bell is headquartered there. Like the airport is named after John Wayne, if those are giving you any sense of what Irvine is like. If you go to the
Okay.
mall, it's just a bunch of Maseratis in the valet. Um,
So
and yes, it's
this town follows Denver into the party. What do they do it?
Denver. Okay, so this town follows Denver into the party. Orange County is kind of like the quiet girlfriend you forget is there. Like,
Hmm.
they're just kind of like shadowing their partner to every occasion. They might be like in the background wiping the counters down at a party so that the host's house doesn't get too messy. They're that person. You don't expect them to contribute a whole lot, but you can't really be upset if they're there because they also, aren't causing any type of, ruckus.
Okay. Awesome. It sounds like a pretty interesting party, if not fun party, with all these cities.
I do throw a good party.
Yeah. Thanks for doing that. I just try to do something stupid for the penultimate segment, but
No, I've never been asked that question before, so thank you.
cool. All right. The final segment is my friends off and on segment. I mentioned it a bit in the email, but yeah, again, another TikTok that seemed to be popular. I would tell people these certain books are friends off books. Do you have any of those that you think if someone said this was your fave, I'm out of here?
Ah, I hate The Catcher in the Rye. I cannot stand that book. So if somebody told me it was their favorite, I'd be like, one, you're childish, and two, we clearly just see the world of writing differently. So I don't think it would work out very well. You had also mentioned in the email that like you friends off and on, right? So when back in the day when I was like when OkCupid was kind of a thing, I was on that website, that dating website, and I had a guy reach out to me because I was the only woman who had listed The White Boy Shuffle by Paul Beatty as one of my favorite books, and that was his favorite book. And so he was in DC in grad school at the time. I was in Riverside in California in grad school at the time. So we were on clear opposite sides of the country, but we did end up meeting up for New Year's Eve, and we did subsequently date years later. And so, so that's like an example of somebody being like, oh, I definitely want to be her friend because of this book. But I also dated a guy who, when I met him, his dog was named Tesla. And I was like, what's that about? And he's like, oh, me and like, his ex-wife, we knew we would never be able to afford one, so we named our dog after him. I was like, oh, okay, haha, like cool. But then when I went to his home, I saw on his bookshelf that he had the autobiography of Elon Musk. And I was like,
Mm.
no, you are a Musk fanboy and you've been deceptive about this. And so, I mean, I didn't break up with him on the spot, but I was not surprised when the relationship didn't work out because he was very upset with me because, he's like talking about how these electric cars are going to save the environment. I was like, well, as someone who's Filipino, like, I don't know if you know this, but they are drilling illegally in certain parts of the Philippines, ruining the environment in the name of you like having this fancy designer electric vehicle. So
Mm.
no, like it's marketing hype. I don't
Yeah.
know. Don't tell me you're an Elon Musk fan.
I am not an Elon Musk. That's a good
You're
friends
like, well,
off.
I'm not now.
No, that's a good friends off book for sure. Do you have so continuing with friends on, just these are just books that you love, you would recommend to anybody, or just ones you want to pitch, whatever.
Yeah, Kiese Layman, who was so kind to blurb my book, his first two books, Long Division and How to Slowly Kill Yourself in America, when I was reading them when I lived in Denver, I was like, oh my gosh, these like Kiese can write. And so like I went on Facebook, I saw we had some mutuals. I was like, y'all should tell your friend Kiese he can write. And they're like, you could just tell him yourself. And I was like, what? I can? And so like that's how like I met Kiese Lehman, and we it was a friends on thing because he wrote books that I admired. And then he really his career really took off after he published Heavy. And I, highly recommend that memoir, especially like if you're into extremely vulnerable writing. So, always a lot of respect for anyone who is also a fan of Kiese's writing. Melissa Febos is someone that I read and turn to quite a bit. Ocean Vuong's On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous. There's just so much that you can draw from that book about like just writing with vulnerability. Therese Myatt's Heartberries, gold standard. Like if you've read that book, we can certainly be besties. Please come sit
Yeah.
next to me. And then to promote a book, the mango tree that's coming up, Annabelle. I think her book comes out in April, and she writes about being half Filipino, half white in
Mm,
Florida, and just kind of like the ways in which like her family unfolded from that. And as someone who's a bluegrass Blackapino who grew up Black and Filipino in Kentucky, I'm always interested in those sorts of experiences.
cool. I'll have to check that out. Uh, I read Heartberries last year. It was one of my tops for nonfiction, fiction especially. And
A
I have
fellow Canadian.
fellow Canadian, exactly. I have How to Kill Yourself Slowly in America next to my bed, but I haven't started it yet. I didn't realize it was the same person here, so that's
Mhm.
interesting. Yeah, so those are good friends on books. I don't know if I have to say that. Anyway, yeah, so I guess that's the end of the pod. We'll just wrap some things up. Thank you so much for
Okay.
coming on, Minda Honey, and hopefully I'll see you again when you publish your next book.
Thank you so much for reaching out and having me on the podcast, Tim. If folks would like to keep up with me, they can come visit me at mindahoney.com. I'm also Minda Honey on Instagram and Twitter, but concerning my feelings about Elon Musk, I'm much more active on Instagram than I am on other platforms. Not that, big meta fan either, but social media, necessary evil. So yeah, folks want to keep up with me, come find me. I teach writing workshops throughout the year at a variety of places. So I'd love to hear from folks. And you can find the Heartbreak Years, bookshop.org, amazon.com. On my website, I link to the local indie bookstore in Louisville that I have a relationship with if you would like a signed copy.
Awesome. That's great. So thanks again, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time. Bye, Tim.
Bye.